Hi boys and girls, for this investigation with energy, we are going to be investigating heat energy. Okay, so I have here some butter, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick the butter outside for 5 minutes. I'm also going to put butter in a pan for 5 minutes, and we're going to see how the butter changes when we increase the heat energy for 5 minutes. Then after those 5 minutes, I'm going to take the butter off the pan or out of the pan, and I'm also going to take the butter out of the sunlight, and we're going to see the changes that happens in the butter after decreasing heat energy for 5 minutes. But before we do that, we want to write down what we observe before we add any heat energy or before we decrease heat energy. So here I have half a stick of butter. So just looking at this butter, what do we notice about it? Well, I noticed that it's kind of yellow in color, so I'm going to write that down. And it says sunlight and pan, but before we put heat, the butter is going to look exactly the same for the sunlight and for the pan. So I'm just going to kind of write it in the middle. So I'm going to say yellow. Okay, it's a solid. Right now, it's not a liquid. Okay, it's shaped. What is it shaped like? Does anyone remember that 3D shape? It's a rectangular prism. So you could even put just shaped like a box, we'll say, or you can put rectangular prism. Okay. Even though it is a solid, I don't know if you've ever felt butter, it's pretty solid, but on the outside it's really slick. So we can even write down how it feels. It feels kind of a little bit slimy. Right, now that I've put down my observations before I increase the heat energy, I'm ready to take this butter outside and let it sit in the sun for 5 minutes. And then I'm also ready to put it in a pan and see what happens after 5 minutes of adding heat from the sun and also heat from the pan. So that's what I'm going to do now. And I'll be back in about 5 minutes and we'll look at the changes and how the butter changes from this shape and see what change the sunlight and what change the pan adds to it as well. All right, so I let my butter sit outside for about 5 minutes in the direct sunlight. So I made sure to do this on a very sunny day where it was pretty warm outside too, and I noticed some change with my butter. I also put my butter in a pan and put it on low heat on the stove and let it sit in the pan for about 5 minutes. As you can see, there's a lot of differences in the way the butter looks. So let's first start with the butter that was out in the sunlight. Okay, so if you can see, some of the butter has kind of melted around the plate, and you can kind of see that butter that's pooled there that has kind of turned into a liquid form. So I'm gonna put some observations that I noticed, okay? So on my little recording sheet, after 5 minutes of increasing heat in the sunlight, the butter, I'm gonna write that some butter melted. Okay, but I do notice that even though some of the butter melted, that it's mostly the same shape. So I'm gonna say mostly the same shape. And it's still mostly solid. There is some melted butter, but it is mostly solid. So I'm gonna write that there also. Mostly solid. Okay, and before I felt it, it was slimy. It's still slimy, but as you can see, it's a lot softer than it was. So I'm gonna write that down too. Softer when touched. Okay, and then I have my butter that I heated in a pan on low heat for about 5 minutes. And we can see that this butter is completely melted. So right here where it says pan, I'm gonna write melted. It's now a liquid. It's not at all the same shape. And then I did just notice the color. This butter is a lot lighter yellow and this melted butter is darker yellow. So I'll just put that too, just for an observation. All right, so now that I have increased the heat for 5 minutes and I wrote down my observations, I'm going to decrease the heat for 5 minutes. So I took the butter that was in a pan and I just put it into a separate dish so that way the heat from the pan wouldn't continue to melt the butter, and I took my butter that was outside and I brought it inside. So I'm going to decrease the heat for 5 minutes and I'm going to see what happens after those 5 minutes, and then we have some questions to answer also. All right, boys and girls, it's been about 5 minutes since I took my butter out of the sun and I took my butter off the pan, off the stove. Even though it only seems like a minute to you, or maybe not even a minute, only seems like a second to you, it's actually been about 5 minutes. So let's see how our butters change after decreasing heat for 5 minutes. Let's start with our butter that was in the sunlight. So as you can see, it's been off of, out of the sunlight. It's been inside of my house for about 5 minutes, and it almost looks like more butter is melted, but I'm not sure if it's just darker in color maybe. But the shape looks the same as when I brought it inside. So it's kind of kept the same shape. So I'm gonna go ahead and write that it's the same shape. And it's still mostly solid with a little bit of melted butter, so I'll write that too. Still mostly solid. Okay, and other than that, not a lot has changed. It does look a little bit softer, but I think that's just from where I pushed it down, or maybe just being out of the refrigerator has kind of made it a little bit softer, so there is a change there. So I'm gonna go ahead and write that too. But for the most part, it has stayed the same. Maybe even it's just changed a little bit. So it's just a little bit softer. All right, now let's look at the butter that's been in the pan, or that was in the pan. So I've left it on my counter for about 5 minutes. And if you notice, it's still mostly liquid. So I'm gonna write that, or it's still, yeah, it's pretty much a liquid. So I'm gonna write that it's a liquid. But if you notice, when I swish it around, you can see that there are some solid chunks, so some parts where it's kind of turning into a solid. So I could say some small solid pieces. But it's pretty much stayed the same also. It hasn't turned back into a complete solid yet because it's only been off of the heat for 5 minutes. But I predict that if I kept it on my counter for longer, that it might turn into more of a solid. And I know if I put it in my refrigerator, it would definitely turn back into a solid. All right, so that's our little investigation before the heat, after increasing heat for 5 minutes, and after decreasing heat for 5 minutes. And there's 2 questions, and we're not going to answer these questions together. I want you to answer these questions on your little investigation sheet. Remember, this could be on a piece of paper, or you could print out this copy, but you can definitely just answer these questions on a piece of paper. Just make sure you do it neatly so that way I can read your answers. So the first question you're going to answer is, how did the amount of heat change the way the butter appeared? So sunlight, was there a ton of heat? Nope, but the pan, there was a lot of heat, and it was more direct heat. So the sunlight only slightly melted the butter, where the pan melted the butter a lot. Actually, it melted it completely. So think about how much heat changed the butter, and how it changed the shape of the butter and how it appeared. And then number 2, the second question you're going to answer, it says, what differences did you notice between heating using the sun and a pan on the stove? So what differences did you notice between just putting the butter in the sun and putting the butter on the stove? And I can already think of some differences there. So make sure that you answer those questions in your science journal on a piece of paper, or if you print out this investigation sheet, you can use that as well. And if you want to complete this investigation, this is a really easy one to do. And even for the sunlight, you don't really need a parent to help supervise. You can just do that part on your own, but make sure your parent has approved you going in and taking butter from the refrigerator. But if you can complete this experiment on your own, make sure you write down your observations instead of just looking at mine. This is a really easy one for you to complete at home as well. So I hope you guys have fun investigating heat. Make sure you answer those 2 questions, and we will see you back here next time. Bye, boys and girls.